Good morning. Welcome to today's genealogy program, which is on the 1950 census. We're all really excited about that, as I'm sure you are too. I'm Jessica Wortman on behalf of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we are coming at you from City Hall. And just a couple of quick things before we jump in. If you haven't been down to the museum to see us, please come by. We're 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard, Wednesdays to Saturdays, 10 to 4. And so we do have an exhibit that recently opened representing Canyon City's history in honor of the sesquicentennial anniversary this year. Keep an eye on canyonsity150.org for sesquicentennial events that the city is coordinating on. And then also we have a hike with a paleontologist coming up, and that's June 4th. And come down to the museum to register. There's a $5 registration fee, and that benefits the Friends of the Museum. And it's going to be a really fun day out in Garden Park with our paleontologist, Joshua Broussard. So 1950s census. Terri has a presentation put together for us. Now I'll hand it over to Terri.
Thank you, and good morning and welcome. It is finally here. Some of us are really excited about it. Some of us may have appeared in the 1940 census. This is our first census, and some regrettably will not appear until maybe the 1960 or 1970 census. So let's dive in and see what we're going to discover. Let's take a look at a little bit of the time period to see what shaped the 1950 census and what kind of drove the questions that the government was looking to find answers for. The 1950s, especially after the close of World War II, was a time of great economic expansion. The men, for the most part, had already made it home from the war and were coming on to the economy. And for that reason, many of the women that had worked in wartime industries were forced to return home. And as the old expression goes, once they've seen gay Paris, they don't want to go back to the farm. So women are seen more in the workforce than in previous decades. Rationing was phasing out. The economy didn't all of a sudden ramp up immediately after the close of the war. There was a housing shortage, for example, as well as continued other shortages. But gradually, rationing was phased out and commodities became more available. The consumers were therefore ready to spend some of their money, and the factories switched back to peacetime production. One of the major influences in the post-World War II era was what we could currently call the GI Bill. The name of the bill was actually the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And it give World War II veterans money for higher education, unemployment insurance, and housing. And in terms of education, many of the veterans did take advantage of this program. This original Servicemen's Readjustment Act did expire in 1956, but subsequent legislation has continued even to this day and is referred to still as the GI Bill. We can see the millions of men and a few women that took advantage of those education benefits, whether it be a training program or attending a junior college, four-year college, or a university. It was a fabulous and continues to be a very well used program. The men came home from war, and while they might have delayed marriage or delayed the start of a family during the Depression or subsequent war, all of a sudden, 9 months later, we're going to have a baby boom. And this baby boom was part of the reason that we needed the additional housing and the expansion of the economy. The car became a focal point. It was no longer required that you live in a city in order to work in the city. So people started to move out to the suburbs. Communities were actually built in the surrounding areas around a city, and people then could commute to their work. So the building boom did increase housing, the requirement for schools, and shopping centers and malls. So the landscape of the nation was beginning to change. The actual census obviously is the first census after World War II. And it's also the first census that was processed by a computer. At this time in the late 1940s, the UNIVAC and ENIAC computers were in existence, these huge mainframes that took up whole buildings, and they were used for the census. It is the last census where the enumerators went door to door. 2 states had experimental districts where census forms were mailed to them. And they found that that process was so successful that by the 1960 census, they adopted the mail-in form. 151 million people were enumerated. And interestingly enough, 1 in 10 people lived in New York State. So still a very, very large percentage of people on the East Coast. Nevada was the state that had the least population. For those of you that are familiar with the census, in 1940 was the first time that they did some sampling. If you remember the 1940 form, there were 2 lines at the bottom of the page. 2 people on the upper portion of the page were selected for additional questions, and the answers to those questions were recorded on the bottom of the page. In the 1950 census, they chose 6 lines, and they're evenly spaced throughout the page to do additional sampling. On the downside of the sampling, some of the questions that they ask were previously routine questions. So in reality, in some cases, you're actually getting less information than you had in previous census forms. The 1950 census was the last year that asked about citizenship. You know, were you born, what state were you born in, or what foreign country? And the 1940 census had also adopted the process of putting an X on the person's name that actually was the informant. And the 1950 census has done away with that. So we don't know who is actually giving the answers. We're going to take a look at in a second about for the different forms that were filled out during the census. But before we do that, we'll also talk about those forms that were used but were not retained. They did enumerate Americans that were living abroad. We're still talking about after World War II. So there were armed forces, there were Red Cross personnel, there were still vessels at sea or government employees that were living overseas. And this information was tabulated. However, the forms themselves were not retained. Babies that were born from January to March of 1950, there were special infant cards that were filled out. And I believe that I know that the information was not retained, and I think I do have an example of it, but there was additional information that did not appear in the actual census form. On the back of the population form that we see all the time, there was a housing questionnaire, and there were fascinating questions asked about what type of house do you live in? Is it a frame house? Is it a brick house? Do you have indoor plumbing? What kind of heating system do you have? Is it gas? Is it electric? Is it coal or wood? And those forms also were not retained. For the Census Bureau, they did do all the statistical analysis, but the forms then were discarded. So what do you hope to find in the 1950 census? Perhaps yourself, but you're definitely going to find someone you know, whether it's a relative, a parent, a grandparent, even great-grandparents, aunts and uncles. So having done other census research, it's going to help you confirm information that you might have found in other sources. You might also discover some new facts in it. We will be taking a look at my grandparents, and my grandmother happened to hit on one of those sampling lines. And it turns out that in terms of education, she had 1 year of college. I did not know that before this 1950 census. So I have some additional work to do. I knew she was a high school graduate, but I never knew she had any college. So this is one of those clues that is going to drive me to do some further research. It might give you some clarification about things. What was the economic status of your family? When we look at some of the columns, we'll see, how many questions were focused on the economic status. We are coming out of the Depression and out of the war, so the economy was something very important. You need to develop some kind of a strategy. The first thing I would do is look at your family tree and look at those people that are in your direct line or in the collateral lines off to the side, and who was alive in 1950. What babies were born in the 1940s that you might, for the first time, find them in the census. What people had passed away in the 1940s that are no longer in the census. So make a list of the people that you actually want to look for. Study the census form. As we have looked at previous censuses, you need to look with a keen eye at each one of the columns to see what information is revealed there. In some cases, we skip over things. We get so excited that we find our people living at a particular address, and we neglect all the other columns. We just go for the names and the ages. So make sure to look at all the columns. The 1950 census, for the first time, we are becoming a mobile society. So check out the neighbors. Are some of the neighbors that have been there for decades still in the neighborhood? Or has your family moved to a new area? and there are a whole bunch of new people in the area. This downloading the enumerator instructions, if you see a code that you think might provide additional information, I hesitate to encourage you to download the enumerator instructions because I looked at it and it's like a couple of hundred pages. And I don't think most of us want to wade through that. But if somebody had a unique occupation or was in an area that was very, very different from the normal population, you might want to look at some of those codes. While the vast majority of us use Ancestry to look at the census and other genealogical records, I encourage you also to look at the National Archives website. And if you want to use your screen print so that you can save this particular web address, it's the 1950 Census archives.gov. That will take you directly to the National Archives website. And we'll talk in a little while about the pluses and minuses of the various genealogy websites. Here is a listing of the different forms that were used to collect the census. So while in the past we have been pretty much used to seeing the population questionnaire and the answers to it, know that there are other forms as well. For the most part, 98% of us are going to appear in that population questionnaire. We've already said the housing questionnaire was not retained. If for any reason you have Native American ancestry, they did do a special Indian reservation schedule. What was interesting about that is it was not done in Oklahoma, where there were many Indian tribes. They appear in the normal population schedule. Infant cards, crews on vessels, overseas census, those two were gathered but not retained. And we'll notice that various territories were recorded on separate schedules. Each one of those, Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, they had individual schedules. And we will take a look at a couple of those just so that you know the different kinds of questions that were asked. Oops. You can look at each one of the pages, but I'm going to just call a little bit of attention to some of the differences from prior censuses on this particular form. We're not going to go over every single column. One of the first differences is that the enumerator was given instructions to record the names in the family in a specific order. Normally, we see the head of the household, his wife, and then children were then recorded. If there was a married child in the family with their spouse, they then came after all the single children. So where we might have seen people in the past go in age order, descending age order, we have specific instructions to perhaps change that a little bit. If any other relatives were living in the household, they were then recorded, and then any other persons like boarders or servants. We do have broader categories for relationship and race. The relationships go, traditionally husband and wife, but we now have lodgers, the lodger's wife. So it's specifically called out the identification of the relationship to the head of the household. We also see in terms of race, we're getting American Indians, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and any other races that might have been. In the past, S has always been used for a single person, but now we're changing S to someone who might be separated prior to getting a divorce, and for those that have previously been recorded as a single, they are now recorded as never married. So you'll see children, 3 and 4-year-old children, and NV, never married. So we have a lot of questions about work. As we've said, the economy was a very important thing. So what you're not seeing is from previous, at least the 1940 census, what was the education level? We're not seeing that. We are seeing various questions about work. Did the person work? Did the person work within the last week? What kinds of occupations did they have? Were they working for a private company? Were they a wage earner? Were they working for the government, or did they own their own business? So we don't see education, we don't see military service. So we're not seeing some things that we have in the past. I don't have a picture. I mentioned that they did the sampling. So sampling was done for the people that fall in lines 4, 9, 14, 19, 24, and 29, every 5 lines. It is not the sampling was not the same on every single page. Some were done on line 3, 8, etc. Some were done on 2, some were done on 6. So we get different sampling throughout. Was the person living in the same home a year ago? Was that a farm? What county was the person living in a year ago? And if they've moved, we're coming home from the war, maybe we're settling in a different area. And this is where we get the nativity of the parents. Previously, it asked for what state we were born in or what country our family was born in. But we've lost any immigration information that might have occurred. So we're getting that only for the 6 people that are sampled. The highest grade that the person has attended, and did they complete that grade? So we're only getting education information for these 6 people. Did they attend school since anytime since February? Yes or no? And if the person was over 30 years of age, they just asked that be checked. We have additional information breakout for those persons that are over 14 years of age to get employment information. And we finally over here get information about participation in the armed forces. Were they in World War II, I, or are they currently in the military or previous military service? Some people might have still been alive from the Spanish-American War. And then finally, there's just a little bit of line, more information about work and the working purpose. But here's one, if you've ever been married, has this person been married more than one time? If they're married, widowed, divorced, or separated, how long since that event occurred? And for women, how many children has she had? So excluding stillbirths. So some key and critical and new information, but not necessarily as complete as prior years. So in preparing this presentation, I was concerned about it's a changing environment every single day. There are new additions to the indexes and the search engines to find your people. But as of last Wednesday, Ancestry has released a fully searchable by name version. We're going to talk about that a little bit because not everything, you're going to experience a little bit of frustration perhaps because you're not going to be able to find some of your people. When doing the census, they processed it on a computer, and they have used handwriting recognition software to interpret the enumerator's handwriting. So while it is fully searchable, you may, and we'll look at some examples, you may have difficulty finding your people. The names are searchable, but not all the other fields that we've discussed were scanned by that software. So volunteers are continuing to work, even as we speak, to record and provide in the index all the other fields, as well as to correct any spelling or misinterpretation errors that occurred in the handwriting recognition software. So the work is ongoing, and each week they publish and release new states, and we'll talk about that at the end. If you use Ancestry, and even if you do not have a subscription to Ancestry, the 1950 census is free. So when you log on to Ancestry, you just simply need to select the 1950 button. When you do, you come up with the search and you can enter your relatives' information. I entered my uncle's information because previously I had not been able to find him. And I wanted to show you that when you do enter it, and even though I selected the 1950 specific census, the only information I got was his appearance in the other censuses that he had appeared in. And you'll notice that the name is spelled differently for each one of those times. But I could not find him in the 1950 census, even though he's living in the same town with several other of my Terrio relatives. So how did that handwriting recognition software misspell his name so that he's not coming up? If you don't find your person, you can use the Ancestry Explore Maps feature. If you happen to know the address where your people lived in 1950, this can be very helpful. So you just select the Explore Maps. And what you're going to be doing is looking for the enumeration district that your family fell in. If you enter the address in here as much as you know and press search, you will come up with a map. In this particular case, we did not enter a house number. We just entered a street name. And this is where it gets tricky. We entered a street name and the census came up and said it was enumeration district 16607 and that it's located in this particular area. When we blew it up, we could not find a Gilpin Street in this particular quadrant at all. I went looking using this search engine for my own family who lived in Newcastle, the town of Newcastle, New York. And when I just put it, they didn't have a street address. So when I put in the Newcastle, New York, it took me to New York City. Well, we didn't live anywhere near New York City. If you put the definition with the house number, and in this particular case, 3434, you get, it's much further north in Denver than the previous map, and you get this. And when you blow it up, you can see that the house is on the right side of the street in this particular enumeration district, as opposed to the left side of the street, which is in a different enumeration district. So if you have an actual street address, type it in to this and it seems to work very well. Another alternative source for looking is the National Archives website, the 1950 census.archives.gov. And you just select the begin search option. It allows you to enter a state, a city, a county, and a city. If your people lived in Albany City, in Albany County, New York, then you need to make sure that you choose that from the list, as opposed to just simply Albany County. You can enter a first and last name or simply a last name and just press on your search. You'll notice that they have a separate selection for Indian reservation schedules, and they have separate things. If you know the enumeration district, you can enter that information. But if you just want to do a name search, you can select this. I did enter Terri looking for my Uncle Charles, and it came up with 3 selections. The first one is someone correctly named Terri. This happens to be my grandfather's brother, and this is the actual page where he lived in Cohoes, New York. Scrolling down on the page, we see some other interpretations for the spelling of the name Terri. We've got a C in there. This is that optical recognition software that is doing this. We also see a first name that probably should be Francis rather than Hansis. And if we look down in the page, we see some names that really don't seem to be spelled correctly. We do get some that definitely are. Here again, we've got that H-E-N-E. You will find lines where it says no one at home. No one, and this should be at home. So the optical recognition software is, it's good, but it's not perfect. And this is why people are working to make these corrections. This name probably should be George. There are others down here with misspellings that should be corrected. This happens to be my grandfather. My uncle does not appear. I have no idea how they have misspelled his name. This is a portion of the actual page, and this is my grandfather along with my grandmother. Her name was Margaret, middle initial C. And if you'll notice, it's interpreted as Margot with an O and an E on the end instead of A and the C. So that's why these people are going through and making the corrections. We see the normal listings of what state people were born in, their ages, and their occupations. My grandfather was a proprietor of a barber shop. It's interesting that this is kind of it is along the Hudson River, but I find a ship fitter and I go, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that there would have been somebody employed on the water. You will notice my grandmother, you'll see these lines. Those are the sampling lines. And my grandmother happened to fall in one of those sampling lines. And it turns out that, yes, her parents were born in Ireland. They were living in the same house a year before. And this is where I discovered that she had 1 year of college. We have some income. She did not work outside the home, but she did have other income from outside, whether it be a pension, rents that were paid on property, other sources of income. Here again, if you cannot find your people, we looked at the Ancestry Map Search program. Stephen Morse, and I apologize, I think that part of the address is blocked out, but this is a very, very helpful website. And if you want to do a screen grab, it is stevemorse.org/census/unified-HTML. And this is also going to help you to narrow down and find the enumeration district so that you can potentially find your ancestors by going page by page rather than using the name search capability. We're going to take a look at this form and we're going to fill in a state, the county, the actual town, and if you know the house number and the street address, you put that information in. And when you hit the enter, we come up with 2 enumeration districts. If you then enter or click on one of those enumeration districts, you then can choose whether you want a National Archives viewer to see the maps or the actual census images. You can use Family Search that will take you directly to the census images for that district, or you can use the Ancestry viewer. So let's take a look at Family Search. And you'll notice that this is for the entire enumeration district and it will give you a description of the enumeration district, 3641, and it will show the cover page and all of the images for that census district. You can select one, you can then go to the next one, etc. You'll notice that there are 34 pages in this district, and multiply that by 30 lines. So you're going to see about 900 people in this particular census district. This is another way to help you find any that you might not have found by doing a simple search. So we looked at that. We looked at the family search viewer. If we choose the National Archives viewer, we get a similar thing where we've chosen Oklahoma, K County, and that enumeration district. We have the 34 pages, and you want to look at the population schedule. So you just simply click on that. Just like in Family Search, it will bring up the cover sheet, and it has all of the images for that particular district, and you can page through them. Oops, excuse me. If we page through them, say your person is fortunately just on page 2, and you want to get a copy of that, there are these 3 little buttons, and when you click on that, you get a download option. When you select that, you then get a whole series for the resolution of the image. I would encourage you to use the largest image possible for clarity and exploration. So you just click on that, and it will automatically download the image to your computer. You also have the ability, as we've seen with those mistakes, you have the ability to make corrections. If you select that button, you get this introductory screen. It allows you to get started. They ask you for your email address, and then you will get an opportunity to make a correction. You need to know the line number as well as what you want to correct. So if you want to correct the name, you put in the line number and make the correction. What if you live in a remote area or don't know a street, but perhaps know just a community or an area? In my particular case, my family lived in New York in Westchester County, but their town does not appear in the listing of towns. We lived in a rural area. So I have to choose other and specify what that area is. My family lived in the town of Newcastle. I didn't even know that it was 2 words. I thought it was all 1 word. So trying to find that was my first stumbling block. It does not allow me to enter a street address. And you'll see that I have numerous enumeration districts to potentially go through. And I did go through some of them. This is where, if you happen to know a neighbor that you might be able to find in the census by using Ancestry and the simple search button, chances are that will help you narrow down the enumeration district. So in my particular case, by entering someone that lived close by, I started by looking at this last enumeration district. I entered that, and I chose the NARA viewer for this particular one. New York State, and I put in the enumeration district. There are 38 pages in this enumeration district. And rather than choose the population schedule at this point and go page by page, I wanted to verify, just because then someone that lived close by, I was able to find, I'm not sure that I was in the same enumeration district. So I selected ED maps. And I blew up the map, and this happens to be the name of the road that I lived on. I did do this search for other areas, looked at the maps, and did not recognize any of the streets or names as being close to where my family had lived. So I fortunately blew up the map and found the actual road. So I knew that this was the correct enumeration district. And from there, just like on Family Search, I went page by page through each one of the census pages for that district until I actually found my family. We're going to take a look at some of the extraneous forms that you probably are not going to run into, but just so that you know, in case you can't find somebody and they might have been in the military, or they might have been in an area where you don't expect them. Here are some of the other forms. This one happens to be the Indian reservation schedule. And what's interesting here is you get a list of names, but you don't even get ages or the relationships. We can assume that this is a family with a father and a mother and children, but we don't know that for 100% sure. So it's hard to delineate. We also see that a number of the columns are kind of ignored, so to speak. They ask what tribe they belong to. I guess because they're on a Pueblo reservation, they are assumed to all be Pueblo Indians. The degree of Indian blood. In this particular case, these people are all full-blooded Native Americans. Can they read, write, and speak English, or do they read, write, and speak another language? And did they attend or participate in any Native American ceremonies? So a unique form as opposed to what we have traditionally seen. Here is one for the military, not overseas, but at a naval base here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we get the listing of, at this point, the young men who are associated. We do get their ages, and we have like a 1 listed rather than they're all males. And this is where some of those codes come in. If you wanted to do further research, you might want to look up what those codes referred to. There are other columns as to work and work availability. This is the normal population schedule, but filled out a little bit differently. So know that institutions, hospitals, boarding houses, all of them are covered in the census. If there happen to be some notes, make sure to read the notes, because sometimes it will give you additional information and might provide just an idea of the kind of place that people were living in and give you an idea of the economic status of things. Most floors have only one toilet. There are 3 floors. In most cases, each person has his own room. They have gas meters into which coins are deposited and coal stoves. The household section for the owner's home is in the back. So you get a little idea of what life was like. You know, they had a coal stove still and coins for the gas. Hospital residents. We see a listing here of women of various ages. And this is the married, divorced, widowed. And I had thought that that was S, but S is for separated. It should be NV for never married, etc. And by looking at the right-hand side of the page on this, it turns out that most of these women are nurses, registered nurses, practical nurses, nurses' aides, etc. So they are residents at the hospital. You also may find at a particular address, and you might think, oh, where are my people? And it says, no one at home, C sheet 75, 76, line number such and such. Not all of them give the reference to the page. And what had me initially confused when looking at this was that the enumeration district might have only had 38 pages. So I'm going, where is page 75 or 76? This was a uniform code that they used, pages that are in the 70s. You might have 30 pages of actual sequential numeration, but then they jump to page 72 or whatever. And so then the no one at home, they went back and actually captured the data for that person and recorded it at the end of that same enumeration district. We'll look at an Alaska census. If you might have had somebody that might have been native born to Alaska or serving in the military in some way in Alaska, it had a different form. In column number 13, it asks, where were you born? And it doesn't ask what state you were born in, it just asks where you were born. So a little bit different than the contiguous United States. They just want to know simply whether you were born in the US or outside of the US. In some cases, the people were born in Alaska. On this form, rather than being the sampling line, they do have the education level of the people. And they want to know, where were you living a year ago? On the regular form, these are supplemental questions or sampling questions, but on Alaska, those are part of the normal form. They want to know whether you were in the military and which war or currently serving in the military. And then they have all the information about work. Were you working? Did you work last week? What type of work are you doing? And what kind of wages are you earning? Here again, this information was in the supplement or in the sampling forms on the others. This one happens to be for the Panama Canal Zone. And we do see an entire family group there. And on, let's see, column 8, they want to know in terms of race, whether you are, I take this back. I think I'm thinking that I have the wrong form here. I'm sorry. Here again, this one actually is Hawaii. I take that back. This is Hawaii. And here again, they want to know where you were born. Japan, but the children are all born in Hawaii. Did you live here within the last year? And other similar information to the Alaska form. There were many people that were stationed in US territories or still on remote islands in the Pacific. And these are the forms that were used for them. So if you have someone that was in World War II that was still in service as late as 1950, you might find them on one of these unique forms. This gentleman is serving on a South Seas island, but in the previous year, he was stationed in Alaska. And his role is he's in aircraft communications. Most of the rest of the questions on the form are very much like the normal census questions, but this is a unique situation where he is being stationed and transferred great distances with a potentially unique occupation. So if you happen to luck out and one of your people was serving in one of the overseas islands, this information is wonderful. I apologize. Here is our canal zone form. And we do have families living in the canal zone. What's interesting here is they had eliminated many of the race categories. It's either white or Negro, and people are recorded as white or Negro. They don't have the Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, etc. They want to know where born, here again, not the state, but what country you were born in. And here's somebody born in the canal zone, someone else, I think that's also in the canal zone. And here they have the schooling, just like we have seen in some of the previous. Did they complete that year of schooling? Are they in the military? And we'll notice that for the most part, most of these people are still in the military. They were not in World War I, they were in World War II. So military status lasted for a longer period of time for many. And what kind of work are they doing? And who are they working for? In most cases, they're working for the government or the private sector. So in conclusion, because of that May 4th update where all of the census forms, the actual pages were released to Ancestry, those that have actually been indexed are the states of, there are 7 states in addition to the islands and territories. The 7 states that have been proofread and the alterations have been made are Delaware, New Hampshire, Vermont, South Dakota, Wyoming, Arkansas, and Hawaii. Excuse me, Alaska and Hawaii. This week, they released Nevada and Puerto Rico. So those states have been fully proofed by volunteers at Family Search. And hopefully, if you have people in those states, which are very small, they you'll be able to find them. They are currently working on Utah, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, and Florida. So those are the enumeration districts and states that you might find coming available to actually search by name on Ancestry in the near future. The 1940 census took 123 days to be scanned, indexed, etc. So we're on an easy track to probably have the complete census fully indexed so that with a name search, probably by mid to late summer at best. So if there are any questions, I will be happy to entertain them. And I'm seeing that there aren't any. I will encourage you. I realize that there was massive overload in this how-to portion of the event. The video will be posted on YouTube, the museum's YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch it at your leisure, stop it and restart it. So, and if you have any questions, you can contact the museum and I will be more than happy to help you. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. As always, that was great. And as Terri was just saying, there's a lot of good reference on our website and links to the YouTubes. And so if there was a past genealogy program you wanted to revisit or other programs that we've done, there's a lot of good resources there. So museum.canyoncity.org. And we didn't have any questions in the chat. But I do have a question, Terri, and you may or may not have insight into this, but I was curious why they dropped the citizenship, box on the census. That seems like that would be valuable information.
I totally agree. It would be valuable information. I am thinking that times were different. We had just come out of World War II. There was not a lot of immigration in that World War II to 1950 timeframe. They pretty much shut down immigration. So while your family may have immigrated during the 1930s or prior to that, at least your parents might have, or the grandparents, that image that might have been captured in the 1940 census. Now today, it is a controversial question as to citizenship. At the time, I don't think it was a controversial issue, but I think that immigration had drastically dropped off in that 1940 timeframe. So,
thank you. I think that's about all we've got for today. Again, just keep an eye on the museum's website and the CanyonCity150.org, and then we will be back next month on June 18th. So we hope to see you then. Thanks for joining us.